Have you ever picked up a Stephen King novel and thought to yourself, I'm just going to read one chapter before bed, and before you know it, it's 3 in the morning? Well, that recently happened to me, and I was wondering, what is it about Stephen King's storytelling techniques that makes his stories so addictive? Well, I recently read one of his novels, Fairy Tale, and I identified four storytelling techniques that quietly rewire your brain to think, just one more chapter. And make sure to watch to the end because the fourth one is absolutely genius and it's something that you see all the time, especially here on YouTube. If you don't know me, my name is Stephanie and I'm a self published writer who's been writing and self publishing for the past 12 years. And I've learned a lot and I've made a lot of mistakes. So this channel is my little way of figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and I'm here to share those things with you. I recently watched an interview with Stephen King where he said it's not his stories and his plot that people are addicted to, but his voice, his storytelling voice. And you can really see that in a lot of his works, including the book I'm going to be talking about, Fairy Tale. While most other authors tend to write like they're a camera in a room watching a story unfold, Stephen King writes in a way where it feels like the narrator is a friend who's sitting by your bedside or by a campfire and telling you the story. Now, by using this storytelling device, it adds intimacy rather than distance. So when you pick up a book, it feels like you're getting to hang out with an old friend who is telling you the story directly. Literally, in this story, the narrator will be talking to you. He'll be addressing you directly. And this is different from a lot of other novels where it feels like you're watching the story through a camera lens, or it feels very distant, almost like in a screenplay kind of way, where you're just watching things unfold. Whereas Stephen King writes the novel so that the character is literally telling you the story. So take a look at the first few sentences of Fairy Tale, where it's literally the character saying, hey, I'm going to tell you this story. And you might not believe it, but this is what happens. The narrator kind of feels like a conversational friend who's just sitting around telling you the story and making you feel welcome into that world. So every time you sit down to pick up that Stephen King novel, it feels like you're hanging out with an old friend. Now, the second thing that Stephen King does is that he'll name specific things throughout the novel so that he can come back to them later. As an example, in Fairy Tale, in the very first chapter, the narrator describes this bridge, which is an important catalyst for the rest of the story. And the narrator continually describes this bridge as the goddamn bridge. And so throughout the story, he'll refer to the goddamn bridge, and you automatically know what he's talking about. And the same thing happens a little bit later when he goes into a house, and there's this long hallway where there's all these books piled up super high, books and magazines and all sorts of stuff. And King spends about a few paragraphs describing this, but when he wants to describe this location, again later on in the story, he calls it the Hall of Old Reading Matter. And it's all capitalized, and throughout the book, he'll refer to the Hall of Old Reading Matter. And what this does is that it allows him to describe the area once, and then by giving it a name, he can refer to it multiple times throughout the story. And this does multiple things. First of all, it makes you realize, okay, this area is important, so it sticks in your mind. So later on, when he refers to it, you can remember, oh yeah, there's that area. Two, it means that he doesn't have to describe it over and over and over again. And three, by not having to describe it again, this improves the pacing of the story. So instead of describing, okay, now he's walking through that hallway with all the books, he can just refer to it as the hallway of old reading matter. And this allows the pacing to go faster so that the story can continue on without you having to read through all this description again. And by doing this, it's already described in your mind. He's pulling up that image for you. He's creating that emotional connection, the goddamn bridge. Now you know that the narrator does not like that bridge for specific reasons. And the story is allowed to just continue on without lingering on unnecessary details. Now, the third thing that King does is that he'll have really short chapters. Actually, he'll have long chapters, like 10,000 word chapters, but they're cut into a bunch of smaller chapters, usually 5 or 6 smaller chapters. And by doing this, he kind of tricks your brain. So instead of thinking, well, I can't read another chapter because I have to go to bed soon and this is pretty long, 10,000 words is kind of long, he'll trick you into thinking, okay, I'm just going to read this tiny subchapter and then I can go to bed. But when you read that tiny subchapter, which is only a few pages, you get to the end of it and you want to read the next subchapter, and then you want to read the next one and the next one, because there's a way lower barrier to committing to 3 or 4 pages compared to committing to 30 or 40 pages. And often these shorter chapters tend to end on a surprise, a quiet implication, an unanswered question, or some sort of revelation that keeps the reader thinking, well, now I got to figure out what that is. So I'm going to read the next micro chapter to maybe answer that question that I now have in my mind. And this is a brilliant piece of structural temptation. By creating these little micro chapters, I call them potato chips. You can't just eat one. You need to go on to the next one and the next one and the next one. And before you know it, you've read that entire 10,000 word chapter. And you want to go on to the next one because the next chapter is going to have more micro chapters. And you're going to think, well, it's only going to take a few minutes to read those 2-3 pages. Just a few more minutes, just a few more minutes. And this is a great way to get the brain interested in figuring out what the next point of the story is. So this is basically the literary equivalent of autoplay. So although you're telling yourself, I can't read that much more, I have to go to bed soon, by reading each of these little micro chapters, suddenly you're 2-3 chapters in, an hour has gone by, and you still want to read more. This is how Stephen King is just the master of getting you to read a book without putting it down. And this leads us into point 4, which is Stephen King's most brilliant way of keeping the reader hooked. And that's his ability to build suspense through promises. So a lot of the time you'll hear that Stephen King is the master of horror or the king of horror, but in reality, he's the master of suspense. He knows how to plant a seed and get you turning the page because you want to see what that seed grows into. And he doesn't create suspense by hiding information. What he does is he creates suspense by promising you that something is coming. And I even did it in the beginning of this video, or I tried to, by telling you that point 4 is Stephen King's most important way of keeping readers hooked. So by giving you this little teaser, I have you kind of hooked into thinking, okay, now I need to go see what this hook is going to be. And you see it all the time on YouTube. Like, there's 8 points, and number 8 will shock you, or I walked into a warehouse and you'll never guess what happened next. These things work for a reason, and Stephen King puts them in his novels all the time. So at the end of a chapter, he might say, well, I thought so-and-so was going to die. I didn't realize that this other person was going to die first. And then you're kind of hooked because you're like, well, how do they die? What happens to them? When does it happen? How is it going to affect the rest of the story? So King will outright tell you that something bad is going to happen. And now you have to stick around because you have to figure out what that is. Our brains hate unresolved promises. So you're going to stick around to figure out what that promise is. Even if you're not even into that story or it's not really the genre you like, if the author promises you something, you're going to stick around just to figure out what that promise is. So I'm going to put an example up on the screen from Fairy Tale. And so you'll see that, yes, this is at the end of a chapter. So after reading this, now you're wondering, well, what's the secret? And what's up with that shed? You got to figure out what's in that shed and what's the secret that Mr. Bowditch is holding. The narrator is not just telling you a story, they're giving you warnings about what is about to happen. So now you're reading because you have to figure out what those answers are. And once Stephen King plants one of those promises, you're locked in. You're going to be reading until you figure that out. And he won't answer that promise until he plants another seed. So as soon as he answers one promise or he delivers on one promise, there's already another promise that's lingering that you've got to figure out. Once you master how to do this in your own novels, you're going to be keeping readers' attention like crazy. You're going to keep them reading chapter after chapter after chapter because they got to figure out what these promises are. And the more you have in a novel, the better you get. And something else that was really good at this was the TV show Lost. They would plant so many seeds And before they answered one, they would plant a new one. So as soon as you're figuring out why there's a polar bear, suddenly you're asking questions about why there's a hatch. And as soon as you're understanding why there's a hatch, you're wondering why there's time jumps. So next time you're reading a Stephen King novel, try to focus on the last paragraph of each micro chapter and each chapter as a whole, and try to point out any promises that he's throwing out there that would keep a reader hooked. And try to figure out how to take that and incorporate that into your own novel. So as you can see, Stephen King's storytelling prowess is not an accident. He spent the last 40 or 50 years honing his craft and perfecting these storytelling techniques to keep the reader hooked. Not just the reader, but himself, because every time he writes a novel, he's basically telling himself the story too. So all these little warnings are things to keep himself hooked as he's writing the stories. So in conclusion, he usually has a very conversational narrator who tells you the story in a really engaging way. He'll name things throughout the book so that they're anchored in your mind as you read. He creates short potato chip chapters that keep you reading one right after the other, and they create a lower barrier of entry into the novel. And he creates suspense built on promises. So Stephen King doesn't just scare you into turning the page. He basically warns you that if you don't turn the page, you're never going to learn the secrets to all these promises that he's planted throughout the novel. Now, if you enjoyed this video or if you learned anything from it, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'm actually going to create another video similar to this one about the differences between Stephen King and George R.R. Martin, specifically how they write fantasy. Because I'm writing my own fantasy series and I've been reading a lot of fantasy just to see what other professional writers do when it comes to telling a fantasy story. And I'm also going to create a video about why Stephen King writes so fast compared to George R.R. Martin, who doesn't. So subscribe if you're interested in that. And if you're interested in writing and self-publishing your own story and becoming the next Stephen King, then check the description box down below, because I'll soon be releasing my own book on how to write and self-publish your own novel and start your self-publishing journey. Until then, happy writing, and I'll see you in the next video.